London, Ontario is sometimes referred to as the Forest City, branded as an area surrounded by trees and nature. But London has a darker side that is hardly ever talked about. According to the author Michael Arnfield, who wrote the book Murder City, The Untold Story of Canada's Serial Killer Capital, London, Ontario, between the years of 1959 to 1984, with a population of only 240,000, half of what it is today, seemed to hold the record for the greatest number of serial killers active at the same time relative to the population. There have been between 60 to 70 known serial killers in Canada's history, and at least 6 of them, and possibly as many as 9, came from the London area. That's a buttload of serial killers active in one area at one time, around 10 to 15% of the national total. If you lived in or near London in the late 1970s, you may recall the cloud of terror that hung over the city as police searched for one of these suspected serial killers. Russell Maurice Johnson is one of Canada's most violent and prolific serial killers, and is mostly unknown to the public. He was only ever charged with 3 murders, but is admitted to killing 15 women. Russell Johnson terrorized women between 1969 and 1977, going so far as climbing the outside walls of apartment buildings and strangling young blonde women in their beds. He would often clean up his crime scenes so that police thought that his victims had died of natural causes. This occurred in at least 4 cases. These murders occurred over a 10-month period, and in each case the women had apparently died in their sleep. In one case, Johnson did the victims' laundry. He assaulted at least 10 more, choking them to the point of unconsciousness. He's described by psychiatrists as a sexual sadist, a lust murderer, and a necrophile. At least one victim was sexually assaulted after she died. When at last he was safely locked up, Johnson left police and the public with a lot to worry about, as time and time again, this savage killer eluded police that were supposed to catch his kind. This is the story of Russell Maurice Johnson, also known as the Bedroom Strangler. Russell Johnson was born in 1947 to a home with 2 brothers and mentally ill parents. He grew up in the city of Guelph, Ontario, and lived across the street from St. Joseph's Elementary School. His father was anti-Semitic and didn't allow his sons to celebrate Christmas because he believed that the stores were owned by Jews who wanted to drain Christians' bank accounts. So Christmas was forbidden, but the family went to church a lot and confession at least once a week. Basically, the message he received from his upbringing was you could do wrong, but just don't get caught. Former classmates remember him as an awkward, oversized kid who was always getting beat up by much smaller kids. One former fellow student would say that every kid in school would want to fight him because he was so big, but you only had to say boo and he would collapse. He liked to play basketball, but just wasn't very aggressive, and Russell always seemed to be overshadowed by his smarter older brother. At the age of 13, he came to the attention of police for stealing women's underwear off a clothesline and for being a peeping Tom. Russell Johnson married young and had a child, but left his family, he claims, when his wife cheated on him. He would then channel his anger into bodybuilding. It was also around this time that the attacks on women in the London area began. The first would occur in 1969. The woman woke up around 3 a.m. to find herself lying on the floor with a man gripping her throat. She would pass out, and fortunately Johnson would be interrupted by the woman's roommate. Johnson was apparently so upset over the incident, he admitted himself to the London Psychiatric Hospital, where he was diagnosed as a sexual deviant. However, 10 days later, he seemed relieved of his symptoms and was released. He would return to the hospital twice more as an outpatient, and his patient record for that time actually read, quote, he might sexually assault a woman. But the hospital never informed the police, and in the years that followed, at least 10 women were attacked and were lucky enough to survive the ordeal. Mary Catherine Hicks was 21 years old, petite, attractive, and vivacious. She was the middle child of 5 children. She was popular, had a tight-knit circle of friends, and a good student. She was in her third year at Western University, and in the year of 1973, she was told she had been accepted into her honors year and wanted to go to Sorbonne for graduate school. Her goal was to teach French at university. On October 18, 1976, Mary Hicks said goodnight to her roommate Elizabeth after returning home from a night out with friends, but she was unaware that an evil presence followed her home that night. Russell Johnson waited until she was asleep and then slipped the lock off the window of Mary Catherine's ground floor apartment and climbed inside. She was sexually assaulted and then suffocated with a pillow. He would leave a book folded on her bed before he left the scene. Russell's assault was so quiet that Mary's roommate slept through the whole thing, and it would take 6 years for her family to be told that her death was a homicide. However, her mother always had a sense that her death wasn't an accident. Mary Catherine would be discovered dead the next morning by her roommate. Absolutely nothing looked out of place. She was tucked in under the covers and looked like she was sleeping. There were no signs of a break-in, no marks on her body, and no signs of violence. But for whatever reason, nobody found it suspicious that there was a pillow partially covering her face. And the apartment door was closed, but not locked. Police and the coroner investigated the scene and came to the sloppy conclusion that she aspirated after suffering an allergic seizure to prescription drugs. Nobody had a clue she was murdered until Russell Johnson confessed to killing her years later. And to make matters worse, nobody notified her family about the murder or the confession. It was only when a police report on Russell Johnson was about to be released that Inspector Bob Young, the man who caught Johnson, made the long drive from London to Ottawa to notify her family. He did this primarily because the Globe and Mail was set to run a story about the capture and confession, and wanted them to find out before reading about her murder in the newspaper. Because of the lack of investigation from police and the coroner, Russell Johnson was allowed to spend the next 4 years hunting women. 42-year-old Alice Ralston was found in her Mercer Street basement apartment in the city of Guelph, about an hour and a half away from London. Once again, there were no visible signs of violence and no marks found on her body. Alice had a medical history of hardening of the arteries, so the coroner concluded that this condition contributed to her death. On March 4, 1974, 27-year-old Eleanor Hartwick was found dead in her Westlake Street apartment in London, with a book she had been reading lying in her hand. Once again, it was believed that foul play was not involved in her death, and she died from a reaction to prescription drugs. Doris Brown, age 49, was a mother to 5 children. Her family described her as a good listener, and a favorite aunt who was always quick to give big hugs. 5 months after his last kill, on August 8, 1974, Russell entered Doris's townhouse and strangled her. Her 16-year-old daughter was sleeping in the next room. Doctors would conclude that Doris died in her sleep. Her cause of death was attributed to pulmonary edema, even though the pathologist found bruises on her throat and traces of blood in her mouth. Her family never suspected any foul play until Johnson was caught and began confessing his crimes. At this point, at least 4 women had been murdered, and nobody was looking for their killer. It could have been sloppy police work, or because the killer was a neat freak. In all 4 cases, the bodies were found in natural sleeping positions, and police were deceived by the cleanliness of the murder scenes. This killer was meticulously clean. Once he even washed the dishes at the crime scene. But this wouldn't last. With each murder, Russell Johnson was becoming increasingly more violent. And rather than becoming more sophisticated in his killing, he became more sloppy. The next murder that occurred left no doubt that a crazed madman was on the loose. On New Year's Eve of 1974, 23-year-old Diane Beitz was planning to celebrate the evening with her fiancé James Britton, who had just proposed to her the night before. But when he arrived to pick her up that evening, Diane's apartment was in darkness. It looked like no one was home. He let himself in and called out her name, but received no reply. He then went into her bedroom, only to find it was a mess. It looked like a struggle had taken place. Furniture was turned upside down, and the covers were piled on top of the bed. He pulled the covers back, only to find Diane's body. She was naked with her bra tied around her neck. She had been strangled, and her hands were also tied behind her back with pantyhose. One of her slippers were found outside the front door, and a second slipper was found by the telephone. A police investigation was finally opened, although investigators were still unaware that the previous 4 deaths were homicides. Over 200 people would be interviewed in the weeks after Diane's murder. According to the building superintendent, he looked out his window around 3:30 a.m. the night of the murder and saw a brown 1967 Buick idling in the parking lot for 4 hours. Police searched the area and found a black stain in the snow where the dirt from the exhaust had fallen. Diane had also received a bouquet of flowers a day or 2 before Christmas, but her fiancé said that he had nothing to do with it. He never ordered flowers for Diane, and a post-mortem would reveal that Diane had been sexually assaulted after she was deceased. Years later, after Russell Johnson was arrested for the murders, police would go over their records and discover that at 10:30 the morning Diane Beitz was murdered, Johnson had filed a police report. Apparently, a suitcase of clothing had been stolen from his car while it had been parked outside his father's apartment, only a few blocks from where Diane lived, attempting to give himself an alibi. About a year after the Diane Beitz murder, Guelph police had Russell Johnson briefly in their hands without realizing he was a serial killer. A woman had found Johnson in her home with a dazed look in his eyes. Fortunately, her son, who also lived with her, was also a policeman. He detained Johnson and called police headquarters. Johnson's excuse was that he had been high on marijuana and wandered into the house by mistake. Knowing what we know now, this was a lie, and a potential victim's life was spared. Guelph police also discovered that Johnson owned a Buick, but because he lived and worked in London, they didn't consider him a suspect in the murder of Diane Beitz. Her killer would wait another 2.5 years before striking again. 23-year-old Luella George was found strangled to death in her 4th-floor apartment in April of 1977. Russell broke into her apartment by climbing from balcony to balcony. This time the killer would also take a few pieces of jewelry and her underwear, which police would find in a garbage can nearby. Once again, the killer had cleaned up after himself. Luella's bed had been made, and nothing in the bedroom had been disturbed. And similar to the first 4 victims, Luella had been tucked into bed and looked as if she was just sleeping. The apartment building where Luella George was killed was across the road from a hospital and was an area where many nurses lived. When news of the murder came out, the result, not surprisingly, was panic. Police were inundated with calls from women reporting prowlers, and these random attacks around London, Ontario on innocent sleeping women would continue over the next few months, and the press would nickname him the Bedroom Strangler, although the situation was much worse than the public realized. The police are still unaware of the 4 original murders. Some women would awake to a shadowy figure slipping out of their apartment, or personal items were moved around. And there were 3 women who survived being raped and strangled. It's safe to assume that Russell most likely thought he had killed them. All of the survivors reported being awakened by a man at the foot of their bed, and several of them had their hands tied behind their backs before they were awakened. And some of the apartments were high-rises. The killer would have had to climb up the side of the building just to let himself in. On the evening of July 15, 1977, a young woman received a buzz on her apartment intercom from a man who claimed to be a police officer, asking her to let him in. She refused, and immediately contacted the police department, who confirmed her suspicions. This man was no police officer. Her skepticism would save her life, but Russell Johnson wasted no time moving on to his next victim. Finally, Johnson became so sloppy, he didn't bother leaving his own apartment building. He ended up killing a young woman who lived only 2 floors above him, and this murder was especially horrific. 22-year-old Donna Veldbloom was originally from New Brunswick and had lived in London, Ontario for just over a year. She worked at a gas station nearby, and on July 15th she had finished her shift and then hung out with a friend afterwards. The next morning, Donna didn't show up to work, which wasn't like her, so her co-workers would contact the police. Police would arrive to a bloodbath. Donna had been strangled just like the other victims, but it was clear that the perpetrator was escalating his level of violence. Donna had also been stabbed in the chest. Coincidentally, Donna's apartment was less than 1 kilometer away from Luella's. It was clear the killer was spiraling out of control. He had never used a knife before, and this time didn't bother tidying up the apartment, but he did bathe Donna's corpse. The police at this time didn't really have much to work with, so they began looking at other tenants in Donna's building to see if any had a criminal record. And that's when they accidentally came across the name Russell Maurice Johnson. He was 30 years old and worked as a stock clerk at the Tabbetville 4 plant. He was well liked at work, although other employees considered him a bit of a slacker. As they dug into his background, police at first found little to be suspicious of. He was an amateur weightlifter and in good physical condition, and worked out at the Central YMCA in London. He also worked on and off as a nightclub bouncer. A fellow co-worker, Ed Oliver, remembered Russ as never being around when customers acted up. But after he went into weightlifting and developed a powerful body, Russ was more than ready to get into a fight. By now, he was separated from his wife, but had a long-term girlfriend named Barbara. But as they dug further into his life, a darker side of Russell Johnson was revealed. One woman who spoke with police remembered going back to her place with him one night, and both of them were a bit woozy from drugs and alcohol. She remembered lying down and seeing a pillow coming down on her face. She blacked out, and when she finally came to, she remembered feeling sick and wondering what just happened. There was also a long history of mental illness in Johnson's family, and a psychiatrist who would later testify at Johnson's trial would state that his family situation was probably the most chaotic and disturbing he had ever seen. Russell Johnson had previously been questioned by police, as he used to live in the same building as Luella George up until recently. And when Inspector Bob Young of the London Police reached out to Guelph to notify them about their suspect, he discovered that the morning Diane Beitz's body was discovered, Russell had called the police to report that his car had been broken into. His vehicle was parked around the corner from the crime scene. Russell Johnson immediately became the prime suspect, but police didn't have enough evidence to arrest him. They needed more. To prevent any further killings, Russell Maurice Johnson was put under 24-hour surveillance. And it wasn't long before police realized their suspect had some serious issues. He was obsessive-compulsive about cleanliness, washing his hands excessively, as well as always wearing gloves and petroleum jelly while he was at work and the gym to prevent contamination. Russell also displayed signs of psychosis, driving randomly before stopping for no reason, exiting his vehicle, standing on the sidewalk for a while, and then driving off again. On July 28, 1977, police felt that they had enough to act and brought Johnson in for questioning. But police faced an uphill battle. If he didn't confess, it would be almost impossible tying him to the crimes. But within minutes, Johnson was a sobbing mess, telling his story to police about his uncontrollable impulses. Quote, "I can't seem to control myself. When that feeling comes over me, I'm lonely and I go for a walk. Sometimes I'm driving in my car and that feeling comes. I can't help myself. I stop the car and get out and start walking, and I don't know where I'm going. Time means nothing." All of a sudden, I'm climbing balconies and I have strength way beyond me. I've got no regard for caution or danger. My mind is racing at a terrible speed. I'm going hand over hand up the balconies, and if I lose my grip, it doesn't matter. Or if I grab something and it isn't safe, it doesn't matter. One time, I was up 15 floors, and the door was locked. The next day I went by and looked up and shuddered to see where I'd been. Johnson was incredibly difficult for police to interview, often telling them he just didn't feel like talking about it anymore. But slowly, the story came out. While describing the murder of Luella George, he tried to explain the horrible feeling he felt in committing the murder, saying it was like playing football and that feeling just before you're going to hit the other guy. He said he didn't remember entering her apartment, but remembered choking her. He knew he scaled her balcony, but was unsure of how high it was, only that it was the top floor, because he saw police there the next day. He remembered that he picked Diane Beitz as his victim, because she lived in the same apartment an old girlfriend of his once lived in. And in the Veldbloom case, Russell had just arrived home around 1 a.m., after a night out, when he was overcome by one of his impulses. He let himself into Donna's apartment with his plastic time punch card, victim blaming by saying, quote, "Why don't people have better locks?" The trial of Russell Maurice Johnson began on January 25, 1978, where he would plead not guilty to 3 charges of first-degree murder for the killing of Diane Beitz, Luella George, and Donna Veldbloom. He was clearly going for a not guilty by reason of insanity defense, although an earlier proceeding found Russell mentally fit to stand trial. Dr. Russell Fleming, a psychiatrist at the Mental Health Center in Penetanguishene, Ontario, would testify that Johnson suffered from acute episodes of a psychotic nature in which he lost touch with reality. Fleming described Johnson as a compulsive obsessive schizophrenic who was seized by violent spells that might have been caused by a love-hate relationship he had with his mother. He and every other serial killer. According to a doctor treating Johnson, he would put the bedclothes back on his victims to, quote, "make it right," and apartment cleanups were done so the victims wouldn't be mad at him. In a police statement admitted into evidence, Johnson was quoted as saying he was seeking psychiatric help after the 1974 and 1977 murders, and complained about his treatment at the hospital he checked into back in 1969. It would take only 2 hours for the jury to reach a verdict, and the jury of 6 men and 6 women would find Johnson not guilty by reason of insanity. He would be committed to the Oak Ridge Maximum Security Wing of the Ontario Mental Health Center at Penetanguishene, where his case would be reviewed annually by an advisory committee, which would make recommendations to the provincial cabinet on whether Johnson was safe to return to the public. Due to a legal screw-up, the previous murders the police were unaware of until Russell's confession were never mentioned before sentencing. This left police in London and Guelph with 4 unsolved murders on their books. So after Johnson's trial, senior police officers compiled a report to submit to the London Police Commission, which read that Johnson admitted to police following his arrest that he was involved with 4 previous unsolved murders and 10 unsolved attacks on women. The report also said that details Johnson gave police of the incidents could only have been known by the perpetrator. This report would be released to newspapers in 1979. Attorney General Roy McMurdy would support the London police report, which also read that the Crown decided not to prosecute Johnson because psychiatric evidence showed he was incapable of appreciating the nature of his crimes. Johnson stayed quietly locked up in maximum security at Penetanguishene for 15 years, held on what was known as a lieutenant governor's warrant. But then in May of 1992, the rules of the game changed. The Supreme Court of Canada ruled that automatic and indefinite incarcerations of those judged insane violated the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. No one really knew which way this was going to go, only that the government couldn't keep Johnson locked up forever if he was proven to be mentally fit. And the very thought of Johnson walking the streets again was frightening as hell to the police who caught him. He would first test this new ruling by appealing in 1994 to be transferred to a medium security hospital in Brockville. Fortunately, his appeal would be denied, but the parents of one of the victims were outraged that they weren't notified about the potential transfer. Joanne and William Veldbloom didn't even know about the hearing until he was denied, saying to the press that the justice system favors the accused, not the victims. And at this point, it had only been in the last 2 years that the victims and relatives had been allowed to attend Russell Johnson's annual review board hearing. Starting in 1992, the Veldblooms and 14 other relatives of Johnson's victims would make the trip up to Penetanguishene once a year to attend the hearing, as they fought to make sure Johnson remained locked up and unable to hurt other women. By now, Johnson had been locked up in a psychiatric hospital for 15 years. But this serial killer was still largely unknown to the public. He rarely ever speaks with the media, and because he wasn't convicted, he's considered a patient in the provincial medical system, not a Corrections Canada inmate. This was also around the time Johnson started the annual fight to be transferred to a medium security facility. And even though the family members of the victims have no standing in his hearing before the Ontario Review Board, their presence has stopped him from being transferred or released. Since 1991, psychiatrists have testified that Mr. Johnson is ready to be transferred to a medium security psychiatric hospital, which is bizarre considering he's been diagnosed as an incurable sexual sadist and an extreme danger to women. Clearly, these psychiatrists don't know their history. Serial killers can never be rehabilitated. And Johnson was clearly not happy with the family members' attendance. And by the year 1998, Johnson had tried to have them removed from the hearing 3 times, as well as the media. Fortunately, the board sided with the families, and they were allowed to stay. When asked by the Ottawa Citizen newspaper why the families attend his annual review, Susan Byhan, the sister of Mary Catherine Hicks, said, quote, "I don't think it's revenge. The only way we can have an impact on the system is just to come and sit here. The only way we can protect society is to come. The more I learn about serial killers, the more I know he should never get out." And there have been moments at these hearings where Johnson has emotionally toyed with the family members. At his 1996 hearing, he wore a Western University sweatshirt to his hearing. Russell Johnson never attended Western University, but one of his victims did. In 1998, it looked like Johnson's transfer to a medium security facility would be approved, but fortunately it was quickly squashed when old handwritten confessions of brutal sexual fantasies turned up in his medical records. By 2002, psychiatrists' opinion of Johnson had shifted in the opposite direction. By now, he had been locked up for 25 years, and insisted he had benefited from treatment programs. However, doctors at Penetanguishene disagreed and judged him too great of a risk to reoffend. He's been taking Lupron since at least 2010 and is now chemically castrated, but is still fighting to be transferred to a medium security facility. You may feel, what's the big deal? He's now in his 70s. How big of a threat could he still be? Brockville would be Johnson's new home if he was to be transferred. The problem is, Brockville has female patients as well, and they are not locked in their rooms at night. In theory, he would be held in an all-male wing of the hospital. But this is a man who gained infamy for murdering women as they slept. The chance is far too great. According to Dr. John Bradford, the forensic psychiatrist who diagnosed Johnson as a sexual sadist when he examined him in 1985, the reoffending rates for sexual offenders over the age of 60 is 3.8%. And for sexual sadists, that rate is estimated to be 2 to 3 times higher. Johnson, however, falls way beyond those categorizations because there's nobody else like him. Most of the psychiatrists that have testified at Johnson's hearings have said that for him to be released would be catastrophic. For his part in this, Johnson claims to be remorseful, but hardly ever acknowledges the victims' families at his annual review. He has never accepted responsibility and has never apologized. He still blames the psychiatrist who should have stopped him, the drugs and the alcohol he was consuming, and his ex-wife for leaving him. And when he has spoke to them, he revealed his crueler side. Quote, "These people should stop living in the past. I've gotten on with my life. Why can't they get on with theirs?" So far, he's been turned down for transfer or release every time he's applied. But the victims' families are terrified that he'll eventually find a board that believes he no longer poses a threat because he's been chemically castrated. His most recent attempt was in February of 2023, where the board found, quote, "The evidence supporting a finding that Mr. Johnson continues to represent a significant threat to the safety of the public is overwhelming. He suffers from a mental disorder, sexual sadism, for which there is no cure, as well as narcissistic personality disorder and substance dependence disorders, and has committed crimes which can only be described as horrific, crimes that continue to impact the victims and their families to the present day." The board said that any reoffense would be grave, and all the forensic experts had considered him a high-risk offender. Bill Veldbloom, brother of Donna Veldbloom, Johnson's last victim, states that Johnson's case is now so dated that most people who looked after the file are now retired, and it's been left up to the families to update and educate new prosecutors and experts about Johnson's dangers before each new hearing, and also says the family's participation isn't about revenge, but, quote, "about keeping an unrepentant person who continues to suffer from his constellation of illnesses from harming another woman." London criminology professor Michael Arntfeld, who teaches at Western University, calls Johnson a case study in malignant narcissism and what we understand to be the underpinnings of psychopathy. Quote, "Even in the 70s, he was a remarkable case study. We see 40 years later, the song remains the same and there's been absolutely no progress." He said Johnson could have been one of Canada's most prolific serial killers had police not been able to catch him. As of today, Russell Johnson is 76 years old and is confined to the Waypoint Centre for Mental Health Care in Penetanguishene, Ontario. Thank you so much for watching and taking the time to hang out with me today. If you enjoyed learning about this case, please be sure to like and subscribe. If there's a case you would like me to cover in a future video, let me know in the comment section down below. To support my channel, you can go to Buy Me a Coffee if you would like to donate. Thanks again, and I will see you next time.